Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. After some 50 days in power, the Israeli government headed by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, and Defense Minister Gantz must contend with old yet intensifying challenges to both the country's north and east amid shifting sands throughout the region. To analyze Israel's current state of security amid regional developments, we're joined from elsewhere here in Jerusalem by Dr. Nir Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us.
Here.
Also joining us from Central Israel is Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, who is a project director on Middle East developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
My pleasure.
And elsewhere here in the building, actually, is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, as well as the host of TV7's Watchmen Talk. Amir, thank you for being here as well in the building. However, unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, we had to contend with new realities. But how about we open today's program and grant us a little bit of a overview of the current situation? Where is Israel standing and where are we heading to?
Yes, the COVID-19 isolation or quarantine is not Great Britain's splendid isolation of a century ago. And it is not Israel's position right now, because Israel is not isolated. To the contrary, its strategic situation right now seems to be quite good. There is no imminent threat, of course. The fronts around it could burst at any moment. This is what Israelis have been used to for the last 73 years. Yet the problems that Lebanon has with its economic and social collapse, that Hamas has in Gaza, the situation in Jordan, which in security terms is very, very cordial towards Israel. Egypt is a very good security partner. And yes, in the distance, there lurks Iran with several problems, which we will obviously go deeper into. But all in all, the Bennett-Lapid government, which you referred to, with Gantz as defense minister, has enjoyed a rare privilege of being able to focus on domestic affairs, chief of which was the budget, which was passed in cabinet a few days ago. But yes, there could be some problem on the horizon, and it seems as if Iran and what is happening in the Arabian Sea or around the Straits of Hormuz and the Red Sea could be the first flashpoint.
Indeed. General Kuperwasser, I'd like to ask your perspective on Israel's current state of affairs, but just to point, as yesterday, Thursday, was the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi. We heard prior to that, during multiple occasions, also during a Knesset plenum session or a parliamentary session here in Jerusalem, as well as later by Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, that Israel will not allow the Iranians to sit in Tehran while the region is being destabilized. There are signals of threats going back and forth, of course. Where are we heading to? What are the things that we should really look at this stage?
Well, I think that, yes, Iran is the major problem, major challenge, security challenge that Israel has. And under Raisi, Iran is going to be even more dangerous and more ready to take all kinds of dangerous steps. And we saw that what happened in the last few days before he entered office with the attack on the Israeli-linked ship in the Gulf, that we should be very concerned about what's going to happen. And one of the implications of that is that a little bit different to what Amir said. Yes, we did approve a budget, but we had to enlarge significantly the defense budget to make it possible for us to contend with the variety of challenges we have on the security and defense fields. I think that what we are going to see now is, yes, we are saying we are not going to let the Iranians, but what does it mean? They don't take our permission. We are just going to try and raise the price that they are going to pay for what they are doing, hoping that this will make them change their mind. The problem is that all the areas controlled by Iran, including Iran itself, is under a big mess right now. A lot of chaos, a lot of instability. The Iranians are very pressed by the ongoing sanctions and by other reasons, that the corona and other problems they have inside Iran itself and in all the territories that they claim to govern. And because of that, they are very edgy and they are very ready, really ready to take risks more than the usual. And that's why they moved in this battle that's happening in the sea, from just hitting carefully ships in the way that will avoid escalation, to taking a step that could and actually did bring about some escalation beyond what we were acquainted with in the past. And that's what's happening. And one of the reasons of that is that Israel has successfully taken steps in order to prevent Iran from turning Syria into an area through which they can deliver weapons to Hezbollah, advanced weapons to Hezbollah, and turn it into an Iranian base near Israel. These are things that Israel did relatively successfully, and including this last attack about 2 weeks ago, that hit severely something that was probably very sensitive and important for the Iranians, and brought about all these reactions, including not only from in the sea, but also the attempt to launch rockets from Lebanon, and the commitment of the open commitment of the Russians to take harsher measures by themselves, to foil the Israeli attacks in Syria. All these things happened as a reaction to this Israeli attack. So we are now in a situation of escalation. Fortunately, I think the big mistake the Iranians did enabled Israel to form a coalition together with the Americans and the Brits to confront the this new Iranian direction. And I hope this is going to deter the Iranians, while Israel keeps in its freedom to take steps to deter Iran by its own capabilities, not only relying on the moves by the international community.
Indeed. Of course, referring to the aerial strike that was conducted by unknown, or at least not, nobody took responsibility for those strikes on the airport in Syria, which Syria, or at least the Damascus regime, was very quick to attribute to the Israeli Air Force. But I'd like to ask you, Dr. Boms, General Kuperwasser also mentioned the destabilizing factor, and while Israel has been successful in thwarting the smuggling of arms from Iran to Syria, which is, of course, quite a significant achievement, or at least transferring those weapons into Lebanon to bolster the precision-guided munitions and the capacity to pinpoint target in Israel by the Iranian proxy there. It seems like the situation in Lebanon is escalating slowly, with sporadic clashes being reported between the Bedouin tribes in certain areas south of Beirut, as well as Hezbollah. How do you see the destabilizing factor that Iran is playing in Lebanon, and to what degree is Israel concerned about those developments?
Well, in Lebanon specifically, the combination of the COVID crisis, political crisis, government that has not been in existence, in fact, for the last few years, going through temporary and attempts to create governments that do not really work. Add to that the ongoing economic crisis that started with the Syrian war and the refugees. Really created a collapse in Lebanon. The banks have collapsed. The Lebanese pound have really lost the ability to really serve as an actual currency. We spoke about the collapse of the Lebanese bank system, and all of that brings Lebanon back to, in one degree, to an abyss, and also brings all the sectarian politics back out. what we've seen the last week in the town of Chalde, south of Beirut, is actually an ongoing situation that began last year, and then you've seen response against Hezbollah forces, and then a counter response, and then in a rare show of sovereignty, the Lebanese military stepping in a very significant way with heavy weapons and tanks to try to think about peace. This is voted by some who, as one of the last attempts to try to bring some degree of stability or sovereignty, because Lebanon, unfortunately, has lost its own sovereignty, and in the south and where Hezbollah is, they're able to create a force that is actually stronger than the Lebanese military. And all of that now comes into a head. Hezbollah is also in crisis, partially as a function of the crisis in Iran. They need to project the ability to at least cater to their own people. And there's more growing concerns, including from some of the Shia community, the friendly community to Hezbollah, saying, look, Lebanon is collapsing. You are focusing on a war with Israel. A few less missiles will actually give us something to put on the table. And perhaps that's a better route. The Lebanese patriarch saying there are other neighbors in the region that have found other ways, more peaceful ways to sort disputes. That's obviously a direct challenge to Hezbollah. And now the Lebanese army had stepped in to stop what otherwise could have been another Hezbollah win. And that tension is escalating. And perhaps what is of concern to us in Lebanon, as well as, by the way, in Iran, two countries that are on the verge of the abyss, just on the economic dimensions, protests, lack of stability, and this is unfortunately always a potential for somebody to act less rationally in order to deflate energy into a different direction and do something unexpected. And we've been in this scenario for a while, and we still certainly remain very attentive to the dimension, to the dynamics in Lebanon, which already has a humanitarian dimension and potential security escalation, as we have seen, even following Gaza, that we have seen an attempt to bring Lebanon into the picture, this time by Palestinian groups. Of course, Hezbollah will take a different direction that will really change this equation and will bring about a very different type of scenario.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, I'd like to hear your perspective on this, especially considering the fact that the Northern Front is currently the key challenge for Israel. It has been for a while. What has changed now with Iran being more on the verge of willing to take the various chances, as was stated earlier?
Well, the start of the Raisi era is apparently a bit different than what we saw 8 years ago and earlier, when former presidents Khatami and Ahmadinejad and then Rouhani took office, because the president is perhaps the number two man in the regime, at least nominally. Of course, when General Qassem Soleimani was there, he outranked Rouhani. But if you go back to the late 1980s, President Ali Khamenei was the heir apparent and indeed the eventual successor to Ayatollah Khomeini. And it seems as if right now the same script is being played out in Tehran, because Raisi was probably chosen as the president in order to groom him to be the potential successor to 82-year-old Khamenei. So it is not only a change of presidents. We are going to see Raisi being tested by Khamenei for toughness. He was, of course, very tough towards so-called enemies of the revolution inside Iran. We have to see whether his foreign policy and national security policy will also be hawkish. And in the meantime, what we learn is that various power brokers in the Iranian military and security galaxy are competing with each other in order to operate. And the attack on the Mercer Street vessel was probably an outcome of these tugs of war. Another point, a short one, is that there are many visitors from the U.S. Armed Forces coming to Israel, either directly from the CENTCOM area of operations or, for instance, the admiral in charge of the Fifth Fleet came to Israel from Egypt, where he was a guest in the launch of a new Egyptian naval base closer to the Libyan border. And what they all see is the fact that while other powers come and go, Israel is here to stay, and the Israeli Defense Forces are the best quality force there is here. And, you know, in the early 50s, when Israel competed with the Arab countries in marketing itself as a bastion of freedom to the West, there was this propaganda line that Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, when lo and behold, it is true now. Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and if you ask a visiting American admiral or general, they will sign on this dotted line.
With that being said, General Kuperwasser, earlier this week on Monday, the former Prime Minister and the current opposition leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, accused Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid of coming to an agreement with his American counterpart, Antony Blinken, during their first meeting about a week after coming into office, that Jerusalem will engage in a policy of no surprises with their American counterparts in all that relates to attacking Iran, to attacking Iranian targets throughout the region, but also most notably against the Iranian nuclear program, saying that it endangers Israel's national security interests, considering that it will probably bring into calculation various elements that may challenge Israeli freedom of engagement or freedom of operations. How do you see that in particular with regard to Israel? Netanyahu also mentioned Israel constituting suddenly a vassal state of the United States. Would you go that far, or is there some equilibrium between the two allies in operations and understanding the key ingredients to maintaining a stable region?
Oh, first of all, of course, we have here two major interests of Israel. One is to be able to defend itself by itself against any threat to its security. And the other is that we need very close relations with the United States, which is our most important ally. And we have to reconcile between these two elements that comprise the Israeli security policy. I would say quite surprisingly that Lapid did not in any point refuted what former Prime Minister Netanyahu said. So there probably is such a commitment. And this, if you take such a commitment, actually you decide for one part of these two pillars at the expense of the other. And I think this is a big mistake, because our concern right now, for example, is that the Iranians are going to push forward with their nuclear project. And the United States is committed to not allowing Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but it is not committed to deny Iran the capability to produce nuclear weapons. So there definitely can be some disagreement between us and the Americans about what is the time in which something has to be done about it. And our approach has always been that we should not allow Iran to have the capability to produce nuclear weapons, and they are getting closer to that. Now, the Americans are so interested in rejoining the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal from 2015, that they would like to postpone the point in which something should be done about the Iranian nuclear project. In the past, in 2012, for example, when Netanyahu spoke in the UN General Assembly, he made it clear that there are red lines for Israel that are not necessarily the red lines for the Americans. He said, if you Iranians are going to, this was the big you know, the picture he showed of the red line, right? That if the Iranians are going to cross a point where they accumulate more than 250 kilograms of uranium enriched to 20%, then Israel is going to have to take action. Now, they are getting there. And if you are going to say that you are not going to take action unless you coordinate it with the Americans and get their approval, this is not going to happen. At the time, the Iranians were very afraid from what Netanyahu was saying, and they made sure that they never crossed the red line that Israel presented them. So I think this is, when it comes to our security, we should be very closely discussing the matters with the Americans, and wherever possible, sharing with them what we are planning to do, but not always and not at any expense. And this commitment is a bit problematic.
Indeed. Dr. Boms, it does seem, however, that Israel is aligning itself significantly with the Americans, also on matters of great power competition, joining in condemning China for the first time in United Nations fora. But beyond that, it seems that the great power competition is the key interest currently of the United States to conclude the global posture review in such a way that would allow it to engage China and, of course, align all of its allies, of course, the Japanese declarations vis-a-vis Hong Kong and other declarations around the world also bring Israel into the picture with regard to having to choose a side and having to engage constructively with the great power which it has relied on for so many years, the United States, in so many levels. Do you see this now also taking a forefront within the Israeli Foreign Office and the various decision-making that it's going to engage with?
Well, first, it's only natural for two new leaders, President Biden in the U.S. and Prime Minister Bennett here, to act in a way that is somewhat different than their predecessors, but particularly when it comes to mainstreaming foreign policy. For us, Bennett had took the challenge of restoring the U.S.-Israel relations and tried to do something from a point in where it is perceived to be too partisan and too reliant on the former President Trump and its alliance with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it's also an attempt to gain American support in an administration that perhaps is not as attentive to some of the issues, security concerns and otherwise, in compared to the previous administration. And so it's important for the prime ministers to bring the Americans to a constructive dialogue that will be very relevant, particularly when it comes to Iran. And of course, when it comes to the other great powers, the same. We need to have an organized policy, and at some point, one needs to pick sides. Israel was able to maneuver when it comes to the United States, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China. At some point, there may be additional pressure to pick sides further and not to engage or not to let China in further. China has been involved in the Middle East and has been involved in Israel. And now there's additional push from the American side and perhaps in return to additional Israeli push when it comes to the more critical issues, JCPOA and Iran.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, about 3 minutes from now, and I'd like to hear, where is Israel heading from this stage? Mr. Oren, we'll start with you.
Yes, the important event which we are all looking forward to is going to be the prime ministerial visit, the Bennett visit to the White House, because with all due respect to the level of foreign minister or secretary of state, the Blinken-Lapid talks were only part of the preparation for the Bennett visit, as was the visit of the National Security Advisor, the new one, Dr. Eyal Hulata, to his counterpart, Jake Sullivan, and to Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, in Washington. This is what was once called in summitry the Sherpas preparing the work for their masters, even though now we know that Hillary and Tenzing were co-equals. We are not looking down, of course, on the staffers doing the real work, and eventually the leaders are only signing on the communiques. So when Bennett and Biden come out of the White House, perhaps on the South Lawn, we will know whether new policy guidelines are handed down.
General Kuperwasser, less than 1 minute, unfortunately. What should we focus on with regard to Israel's security?
Should focus on right now on making the best of the opportunities provided to us by the mess that the Iranians are creating, and at the same time making sure that we don't miss the threats and dangers that are emanating from the same mess. So this is what we have to focus on right now.
Dr. Boms?
Same. Iran on the one hand and Hezbollah, and making sure that the lack of stability in the region is not going to turn into a non-careful move against us. We need to make sure that we are vigilant and we are stopping any attempt to deflate these crises in Lebanon or in Iran against Israel.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank General Yossi Kuperwasser, Dr. Nir Boms, and of course Mr. Amir Oren for being part of today's panel, and we're looking forward to a productive production year for TV7, where you'll join us plenty of times, I'm sure, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.